Hi everyone. This set of slides examines Chapter 7 from Words Their Way, Word Study for Intermediate Readers and Spellers, the Syllables Affixes stage. A quick review of those stages of early reading and spelling that precede the syllables and affixes stage are the emergent stage through grade 1, the letter name alphabetic stage, which typically occurs for kindergartners through early grade 2, and the within word pattern stage, which ranges from late grade 1 to grade 5. Those are typical periods, but recall, as we've always talked about, that there can be students that are in middle school and high school even who are still within the within word pattern stage. When kids are able to identify some of those nasal sounds, NG, NK, NT, MP in their spelling, when they've mastered most of the long vowel patterns in the R influence vowels, and when they're still learning really some of the ambiguous vowel patterns, then they're really ready and poised to go into the syllables and affixes stage. They've had some experience with syllables, typically inflectional endings, like ing and ed, and as we've talked about, they're continuing to build their vocabulary. The reason, as we talked last week, that the within word pattern stage stretches over a long chronological period of time is in part because we have a deep orthography. In other words, there's not just a one-to-one correspondence between graphemes and phonemes, but rather multiple graphemes to represent our phonemes. We don't have enough single letters of the alphabet to represent the approximately 44 phonemes in our language. And one of the most challenging is OU, and in this particular case, OUGH. This led what is usually attributed to George Bernard Shaw, but may not have really been his creation, but rather the creation of spelling reformers, was that we could spell fish G-H-O-T. You could use GH to represent the phoneme as it represents in tough. You could use O to represent the I phoneme as it does in women, and TI to represent the sh sound as it does in nation. So it makes perfect sense, the reformers argued, to spell fish G-H-O-T-I. However, not so really, because if we take into consideration the position of letters in a word as influencing the sounds that they represent, when GH is in the initial position, as it is in ghost, it represents the G phoneme. When O is in the middle position of a word and located in an open syllable, it represents the O sound as it does in gopher. And when TI appears at the end of a word, it represents the T as sound as it does in graffiti. So GHOTI really would not be pronounced fish, but rather goatee. So as Motes argues, in fact, the English spelling is more predictable and less arbitrary than we sometimes think. In this particular case, it's that fourth principle. The spelling of a given sound can vary given its position in a word that we're looking at with the fish example. We're going to spend time this week looking at that second and the first too, I should say, principle, that words' meaning and part of speech can determine their spelling, and also looking again what influences almost everything that we talk about in terms of English orthography is the language of origin. So what does word study look like for students who are in the syllables and affixes stage? Well, typically these kinds of accomplishments occur in late grade 2 into grade 3 and are more solidified in grade 4. They're really beginning to explore the relationships between sound, spelling, and meaning, or phonics, vocabulary, and orthography. Although they've been using for a very long time, since they're preschoolers, suffixes such as ing and s and ed for past tense, it's when they begin to understand these from a more metalinguistic perspective. In other words, that ed represents past tense, but that ed also represents da, t, and et. They're becoming increasingly proficient at combining word parts, in other words, affixes and base words, putting prefixes, those pretty common prefixes, re and un, and dis, onto base words, in addition to adding the suffixes that they've been using for quite a while. But again, this stage may extend through middle school, it says in Words Their Way, but we know certainly that for kids who are struggling readers, it extends through high school. So what do these intermediate readers look like? Well, they're solidly within the consolidated alphabetic phase of air ray, and they've moved into that notion of we're no longer learning to read, but we are reading to learn. And for that reason, a lot of the reading which occurs is of expository or informational texts, textbooks which they find in their content area classes. They've gone, really, when you think about it, from decoding single letters to single syllable words. And now they're concentrating on multi-syllable words. Within the single syllable words, they moved from, again, single letter decoding to letter combinations such as digraphs like TH, WH, SH, and blends like BL and GR as chunks. And now those chunks are getting even bigger. Now the chunks are syllables. They read much more fluently and more quickly because they've acquired a much larger repertoire of sight words. So we're looking at somewhere around 140 words per minute for kids in this phase. And because so much of their decoding is automatic at this point, they can spend more energy and put more attention into the meaning of the text. Writing is also becoming much more fluent, longer, quicker, and again, this automaticity is allowing them to focus on what it is they're trying to say. They're still challenged, as I indicated at the beginning of these slides, by some of the more ambiguous and uncommon vowel patterns, particularly in unaccented syllables where the vowel almost kind of gets swallowed. But they're ready to begin to understand why decision is spelled D-E-C-I-S-O-N and not D-E-C-E-S-I-O-N. And we're going to explore that relationship between spelling and meaning this week. Vocabulary development is critical in this stage, and it becomes a focus point. They're really, what we're really looking at in the content areas is what we call, and what I feel certain you've already heard, the notion of academic vocabulary. Not vocabulary that we use in our conversations or we use even when we're giving a speech, really, but academic vocabulary, which can be categorized into one of two groups. What people call general academic vocabulary, words like analyze, summarize, establish, examine, words that go across content areas, And then domain-specific vocabulary, which is vocabulary unique to their own content areas. Peninsula, say in social studies, isotope in science, and even beyond that, geography within social studies, for example. Now, the idea of general academic vocabulary and domain-specific vocabulary gets played out using different terms in the Common Core standards. And this is all our as educators' academic vocabulary. The standards talk about Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3, and we'll come back to this when we spend the week we have on best practices and what does the research say about vocabulary development. But Tier 1 are very basic words. They're kind of like those Anglo-Saxon words to make the connection to language of origin and to those layers and patterns and meaning in the English orthography. They are words that most students, most children know. But be careful, because English learners may not know these words. So we'll come back to this, but Tier 1 words sometimes need to also be taught explicitly, but generally these are words that kids know because they've heard them in conversation or they've read them over and over again in books. Tier 2 words are those sort of general academic vocabulary. Vocabulary, again, that you may need to teach explicitly. Sometimes we think kids know words like analyze and summarize, but when pressed to explain them and to apply them, they have some difficulty. And then finally, Tier 3 are those words that relate to specific content areas. General academic vocabulary, as I said, are words that appear frequently across content areas. They're sort of directional words. They're words that are difficult to define because they're rather abstract. And even though they appear in varied contexts and across the content areas, they probably need some instruction. And sometimes they're linked to text structure. So in other words, there are words that are specific to sequence of events. First, next, last, for example. And these are some examples of compare and contrast. On the other hand, likewise, along the same lines, this is what's considered general academic vocabulary. Domain-specific vocabulary, again, appear in the various disciplines and have very discipline-specific meanings which students need to acquire. They are often bolded and defined in textbook glossaries, and sometimes they're defined right within the sentence that follows the word. But some textbooks are reader-friendly, and some are not. And so you have to look at the book you're using in the content area and say, is it possible for a student to understand a word in this context? Is it defined in the context, or is it defined in the glossary? And teach students those specific strategies, because they're absolutely critical. The vocabulary is absolutely critical for understanding the content. Words like comma, contraction, declarative sentence, interrogative sentence, fiction, biography, narrative, the notion of theme and foreshadowing are words that are specific to language arts. Science and the sciences, of course, are many, and there are many domain-specific context words that are unique to biology, chemistry, physics, etc. But method, hypothesis, observation, transfer tend to go across the science discipline. Denominator, if you're talking about fractions. Property, if you're talking about operations. And there are three major areas within social studies: geography, history, and civics. So vocabulary just becomes overwhelming for kids within the syllables and affix stage. And and it becomes really what differentiates kids who are successful in school and those who are less successful in school and struggle. And I find this with the undergraduates here at CSUN, that when we read a piece in class, there are often many vocabulary words that they may have some understanding of, but not a deep understanding of. And so every semester, I ask them to keep a glossary of the words. They have to write down 10 words every week. And I'll come back to this at the end of this series of slides, but it's amazing to them how much vocabulary impacts their comprehension of the works that we're reading. So one of the questions becomes, given that there are so many words to learn and that they are so critically important, how in the world as a teacher do you decide which words to teach? And that decision is the first decision you must make. So there are some resources that help. Vocabulary Their Way, written by the same authors as the textbook that we have, Words Their Way, offers domain-specific vocabulary, lists, and suggestions, as does Building Academic Vocabulary, another really good resource for teachers in terms of both selecting and teaching. Typically, developing readers and writers learn many new words, and in fact, the literature might suggest that they learn most new words through reading. And this is kind of what's called incidental vocabulary learning. But what we know, or what we at least think we know now, about kids who struggle to learn how to read, that doesn't always occur. They skip over words they don't know, and they have a difficult time determining words from context, which is essentially what's happening for these more typically developing readers and writers. So as we've talked about in the past, it's important to engage in direct vocabulary instruction. Many people suggest that the first step in this, after you've selected important words to teach, is to activate background knowledge. What do kids already know about this word? Do they know words that sound similar? Do they know words that are spelled similarly? Have they seen words in their environment, or have they heard this word used? So trying to connect with what they already know. And it's important to explain in depth the meaning of the word. And my suggestion is to have a kid-friendly definition at the ready. And then a good strategy is to discuss examples and non-examples. Again, these are not things that I anyway can come up with right on the spot, but instead I like to have them prepared if I'm going to be teaching a vocabulary word. And then pictures for younger children are really important, to have sort of a visual representation of the word if it is concrete enough to do so. And the visual representation for less concrete and more abstract words is often graphic organizers. So graphic organizers are often used in direct vocabulary instruction. But as they say in Bear et al., the graphs and procedures are no more than structures to explain to students what particular words mean. It is the explanation, the talk, that is important. So those resources that I showed you, the Marzano piece book and the Vocabulary Their Way, not only include lists of words and lists of related words within the content areas, but both of them contain many, many graphic organizers. These are two which are in your textbook. A semantic map for a unit on animals in the center, the main topic, and then what they eat, self-defense, endangered animals, and pets. So a way of taking animals and dividing it up as a way of understanding its meaning. Same for colony. What is it? What is it like? So those sort of discussion and descriptions, and then examples and non-examples. And finally, the book suggests a concept sort. Marilyn Jagger Adams, who's the author of the book Beginning to Read, brought together in the early 1990s almost all of the research which had been accumulated over the last, say, 20 years in the area of reading. And so this was a classic book. Barrett, I'll quote from this book, and I'm going to read what Adams wrote. Learning from context is a very important component of vocabulary acquisition, but this means of learning is available only to the extent that children bother to process the spelling, the orthographic structure of the unknown words they encounter, where they skip over as an unknown word without attending to it, and often readers do, no learning can occur. So I'm going to break that down a little bit, that quotation down a little bit. And I'm going to start with that the idea that vocabulary learning is available only to the extent that children bother to process the spelling, the orthographic structure. In other words, how important word elements combine. So what does orthographic development look like in the syllables and affix stage? Well, in the beginning of this particular stage, kids are beginning to really pay attention to plural endings, books and dishes. They're also beginning to pay attention to unusual plurals. So goose, geese, knife, knives. And then those that represent both singular and plural, one fish, two fish, and the famous Dr. Seuss book. Inflectional endings, as we talked about, past tense, and ing. So ed, ing, s, es, and unusual plurals. Changing y to I and adding ed or s, which is simply spelling, and then compound words. In the middle stage, they're beginning to pay attention to open and closed syllables. Closed syllables, as in button and window, where the vowel is short because the syllable is closed, and the vowel is bookend in button with B and T, and then T and N, and in window with W and I, W, N, and D and W. And open syllables like bacon and lazy, where the vowel is not protected, that first vowel, and it represents a long, what we call a long vowel sound. They're spending time reviewing vowel patterns in two-syllable words. So in the within word pattern stage, they're looking primarily at one-syllable words and long vowel patterns. In this stage, they're looking at two-syllable, three-syllable words. Vowel patterns in accented syllables and in unaccented syllables. How to spell ch. Badger, major, village. And looking at homophones and homographs, and special consonants, the hard C and the soft C, the hard G and the high and the hard C, continuing, but often in two-syllable words. And finally, in the latter portion of this stage, they're really looking at simple prefixes and inflectional and derivational suffixes. So what's going on here? Well, the orthography or the spelling system is then providing a foundation and a scaffold for a certain kind of vocabulary development. So prediction, a three-syllable word, what you want kids to be able to do is to pull apart the orthographic structure. You want them to be able to identify the syllables, the pre, the dict, and the ION. What the Touch Phonics video that is up for last week, if you turn off the sound and you just watch what that student is doing, they're pulling that word apart into its orthographic structure. or what we call in the education reading literature structural analysis. And so that's what we're looking for at this particular stage. One way to support that are these kinds of word sorts. So how important word elements combine, you can do sorts. You reconsider, repay, recharge, unlock, unplug, disloyal. So matching those with the headers, reorder, unclear, disagree, is a good way to get kids to pay attention to those syllables and how you pull a big word apart into little words, words which are much more manageable, parts which are much more manageable than that big word, and it allows them to decode those big words. And another example here. So one way to support orthographic analysis is through these kinds of word sorts, and again, these are in Words Their Way. Now, when we talk about important word elements, important is the critical word here, because the important word elements are elements and parts of the word that carry meaning. And now we're shifting from orthographic structure to morphemic analysis. And morphemic analysis then supports vocabulary development because morphemes are the smallest unit of meaning in the language. The word cat has 3 phonemes, k, a, t, but only one morpheme. It's the chunk C-A-T together, which means a type of animal. However, cats has 2 morphemes. Cat is a morpheme, and the letter that represents the S that represents the sound and plural is a second morpheme. So morphemes may be whole words, as in cat, parts of a word as a suffix, or a single phoneme. Phonemes can be categorized as free or bound and further divided within these characters and these categories, and I show you this just for our own sort of academic vocabulary. So morphemes may be free, and these are content words. They stand alone, like cat, like dog, like moon, like mother. And they may be function words like the, a, and, but, the little words that hold the language together. Or they may be bound. They cannot stand on their own as a word. And that includes prefixes, bound roots, and suffixes. Bound roots refer to either Latin roots or what I believe linguists call Greek combining forms. Suffixes then are either inflectional or derivational. So that's how this category of morphemes, the smallest meaningful unit in the language, gets divided up. So here we have a graphic organizer. When you understand this, then morphology supports vocabulary development, because not only do you pull apart the syllables, the pre, the dict, and the shun in this case, but then you can attach meaning to those parts. Pre, before, dict, to speak or say, and the state, quality, or act of, and you can pull it together and understand that prediction is the act of speaking before, to say in advance. Morphemic analysis, I think, is really one of the directions that vocabulary instruction is going, and this is a relatively new direction. When you understand structural analysis and you can pull apart the orthographic parts of a word, as we do in pre, dict, shun, and you can attach meaning to those parts, then you get more quote unquote bang for your buck in terms of vocabulary development. So the steps for direct teaching are to examine the word for orthographic parts, to then assign meaning to those parts, and of course you have to learn those meanings. Try out the meaning in the sentence. Does it make sense given the context? If not, and It's critical to understanding the passage, then look it up in a dictionary and record the word in a chart or notebook for review. And I just want to go back to that notion of the undergraduates that I work with here at CSUN. Recording the words that they're learning in a personal dictionary or a glossary is critically important. It develops a sense of word consciousness. And that's what Marilyn Jagger Adams is also talking about. Because she says, that again, that we skip over words without attending to them if we don't know their meaning. And as a result, we don't learn the word and we don't understand the passage. So becoming word conscious is critically important for us to help kids become independent word learners.